Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and this is the xDuoo TA-66. This is a $250 US entry-level output transformerless vacuum tube headphone amplifier. That is a lot of lingo, which we will unpack and explain in the course of this video. Because it is an entry-level vacuum tube headphone amp, there is probably a significant portion of the audience here who is not going to know what OTL means, what a high output impedance is, why this kind of amp has a high output impedance, and what kind of headphones that means you probably should be using with this amp. We'll cover all of that in this video, as well as talk about the merits of this piece right here. Speaking of this piece right here, this was a kind loan from Apos Audio. Apos Audio has asked nothing in return other than a fair and honest evaluation of this product and an affiliate link, which you will find in the description down below. So if you like what I have to say about this product and you are interested in buying it and you also want to support my channel, please consider using that affiliate link and I will get a kickback. But again, Apos has made no attempt to influence my opinion on this piece or any other, and so all of the thoughts you are about to get are mine and mine alone. Alright, so that's quite an intro. Let's go ahead and do shameless self-promotion, and then we will talk about this cool entry-level headphone amp. Here we go.
Hello. I'm one of the reasons that Wave Theory can't spend all of his money on audio gear. He wants you to know that your support is vital for keeping the channel running. So if you enjoy Wave Theory's bussin' review riz and no-cap review style and want to encourage him to stay in the basement so I don't have to listen to his dad jokes as much, like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also send him a donation on PayPal or sign up for the Patreon. Links are in the description. Now on to the review.
If you're just dying to get my takeaway here of the TA-66, I think it is a solid entry point into vacuum tube headphone amplifiers. It's not going to be the best headphone amplifier on the market. It's only $250. But as an entry point into what vacuum tubes and vacuum tube amplification is all about, particularly for headphones, it is rock solid, and I enjoyed listening to it and was actually fairly impressed by some of its technical abilities. So we'll unpack all of that here in a little bit, but that's going to be my takeaway of this unit. From a sonic standpoint, there are a couple of ergonomic quirks that I will mention through the video here, but at this price and given what this does at its price, I don't think those ergonomic quirks are going to be much of a deal breaker for very many people. All right, so let's talk about specs real quick, and again, this is a vacuum tube headphone amp. It uses vacuum tubes in its electrical circuit there to help with the amplification to power headphones. $249 US. It is rated at 200 milliwatts of output power into a 300 ohm load. Okay. It also is claimed to be an output transformerless, or OTL, amp circuit. What does that mean? Okay, vacuum tube amplifiers are voltage amplifiers. They do their amplification, in other words, increasing the amount of energy in the music waveform by increasing the energy differential between 2 points, aka increasing the voltage that comes across there. Now, for reasons that I won't go into here, vacuum tube amplifiers also tend to have a high output impedance. Now, what is an output impedance? An output impedance, what causes it and all of that isn't really the point right now, but in practice what it is like putting an extra resistor in series with your headphone or your speaker, if it is a speaker amp, but in this case a headphone amp. But putting a resistor in series with your headphone. And what that does is decrease the damping factor on the headphone, because if that resistor in series with the headphone is there, it will take some of the energy that the amplifier is kicking out and convert it into something that is not the mechanical energy of a sound wave. It's usually going to be thermal energy, which we will feel is heat. And what that does is decrease the amount of energy that is left over to reach the headphone driver and thus control its motion. And it's called damping factor because damping factor is a way to measure how effectively an amplifier can stop a headphone or a speaker driver from moving. So once it's already moving, how much control can the amp exert over that motion to either change direction of that driver or bring it back to rest? That's what we mean by damping factor. The higher the damping factor, the more able the headphone or the amplifier is able to control that driver motion. The more controlled the driver motion is, usually the tighter and cleaner and more crisp the sound is. The less controlled the driver motion is, the sloppier and like more blended together the sound can get. Right? And we want a balance there. We want our sound to have some smoothness and blended togetherness, but we also want it to have enough separation between successive sounds in there. So there's a balance to be struck there. All right, so what does that mean for the kind of headphones that you should be driving with this amplifier? And that's going to be high impedance headphones. I think the line of demarcation right here is about 80 ohms and up are the kinds of headphones that you want to be powering with this amplifier, because that's going to get the damping factor into the comfort zone for most listeners. Now, if you have a personal preference for a really like blended together, we call it a wet sound, that's fine. If you have a preference for a very highly controlled, very highly damped kind of dry sound, that's fine too, but most people land kind of in the middle. So to reach that zone, I think you want to start with 80 ohm headphones on powering 80 ohm headphones with this piece. Okay, so what an output transformer does, bringing it back to that and why this is called an output transformerless piece here. What an output transformer does on a tube amp is decrease that output impedance. Basically, it changes the amount of voltage and current output at the output so that you can plug in a wider range of headphones, or in this case of speakers into it. Okay, because speakers in particular, but a lot of the headphones out there anymore, are not particularly high in impedance. Speakers are like usually between 2 and 8 ohms anymore, and headphones are commonly definitely less than 50 ohms, often less than 30 ohms anymore. All that. So to use a vacuum tube amp with those kinds of things, you need an output transformer that will decrease the amount of voltage output a little bit, increase the amount of current output, and in so doing, usually decrease the output impedance so you don't have that damping factor worry, okay, with those low impedance headphones. The problem with those output transformers is that they are very hard to build, and to build well so that they don't mess with the sound in undesirable ways. And so that also means that they get expensive, okay, because you got to get the parts, you've got to design them well, and then you also have to build room into the chassis of whatever it is that's going to contain it. All that. So all of that adds cost to the headphone amp or the amplifier, because it could be a speaker amp too. So what an OTL amp does is they just say, we're not going to mess with that. We're just going to remove the output transformer. But then that, of course, brings back in the high impedance here. So that's what this one has done, is removed the output transformer, which cuts out an expensive circuit element to keep a price down. But then it also means that that high output impedance becomes a factor, and you should look at 80 ohm and up kinds of headphones. All right. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the build of this piece. And I have a little clip, because this thing gets a little bit on the heavy side and it's got glass parts in it, all that with the tubes. I'm going to cut to a clip where I show you a close-up of the builds, and we'll go ahead and do a quick unit tour and talk about how it's wired internally a little bit and why that's cool. So let's cut to that. Unit tour we'll do this way, up close and personal, but without me holding it up, because it's kind of heavy and it's got glass parts in it and so forth. So get the tube to sit in there nice. You can see that they do wobble a little bit, the tubes. Anyway, so that's something to keep in mind. They fit in snug enough, but it does move around a little bit. Okay, front panel. This is it. Headphone jack and volume knob. This is a stepped potentiometer here, and you can hear its clickiness. Okay, so it's got a fair amount of resistance on that click, so just keep in mind that that's a thing. It's not a smooth turn if that matters to you. Okay, side. Ventilation, you see the two different size tubes, and you see the big housing for the power transformer up here. Back. Okay, input, preamp output, power switch. The power switch is on the back. Okay, that is something you have to keep in mind. You flip this on here, the tubes will always be on, so you do need to position this such that you can reach around here and turn this on and off back here if you want to preserve your tube life. So that's one ergonomic complaint I have about this unit, but otherwise it's a very simply made but ruggedly made, okay, piece. And inside, you can't really see it, is point-to-point wiring. There's no printed circuit board or PCB inside here. Someone went through and like manually soldered wires together inside of here to complete the circuit. Okay, no green circuit boards with copper traces on them or anything like that. Okay, but pretty cool looking unit. Other than that, I mean, the power switch on the back is a bummer, but when you power it on, there's a cool blue LED that glows around the red knob and against the gray with these angled cutouts here. It looks cool. All right, so I like the aesthetic, and the build is simple and straightforward. Turning our attention towards sound, let's talk about the test gear that I used for this. And let's talk about sources, things that I put into it. Music files that I would have played would have been FLAC files that were either lossless or high-res that would have been played locally from a local music server or streamed via Qobuz, both of those accessed through Roon. There also would have been some DSD files played locally also through Roon. Roon endpoints would have included a Sonor Ultra Rendu streamer or a Chord 2Go streamer. The Ultra Rendu was routed through a Singer SU6 and then onto various DACs. The 2Go was connected to its matching Chord Hugo 2 transportable DAC amp. Standalone DACs that the SU6 would have fed would have been my Berkeley Alpha Series 2, the Ferrum Vondla, which I'm working on a review for, the Musician Pegasus, and were there any others in there? Okay, that's enough to give you an idea that I hit this with some pretty high quality stuff there to see what it could do. All right, the headphones used are going to be mostly the high impedance stuff. ZMF Bokeh, which I just did a review for, so see a link down in the description below for that. The Mastrop plus Sennheiser HD6XX, which is a 300 ohm headphone. The Beyerdynamic DT880 600 ohm variant. And then I also got out my Audeze LCD2 pre-phaser. It is an old revision 1, and that one's about an 80 ohm nominal impedance, so I tried that on here. I also tried the Focal Radiance, which is a low impedance dynamic driver headphone, as well as the HiFiMan Ananda Nano, which is a low impedance planar magnetic headphone. And I used those two long enough to realize that they were not good matches for reasons that we had discussed earlier. The effects of the low damping factor were clearly audible on the Radiance, and it sounded very sloppy, very boomy, very uncontrolled, and I didn't like that sound at all. The Ananda Nano was, I think, trying to draw more current from this amp than it could deliver, because I was getting audible distortions in the bass, particularly on kick drums and things like that through that headphone, so it's not a good match either. But the Bokeh, the LCD2, the HD6XX, and the DT880 all sounded pretty good on this thing, and so that's where a lot of my listening took place, especially with the Bokeh, since I was reviewing that here lately. That got a fair amount of time on the TA-66 here. Right. Assuming that you do stick with the 80 ohm and up headphones, what do you get? And the answer is pretty good results. Like, if you are looking for that vacuum tube sound, that kind of stereotypical vacuum tube sound, I should say. And I'm going to emphasize that it's stereotypical because tube amps can be just as varied and diverse in their sound as solid-state amps can be. Some of them are the stereotypical sound, which we'll refer to as kind of like this warmer and thicker kind of presentation, which is a lot like what this one is. But some of them can be very neutral, very dry, very detail-forward kind of thing. If you're familiar with LTA or linear tube audio, that would be an example of a highly resolving, neutral, and like play it right down the middle, clean kind of sound. Okay, but this one is more of that stereotypical sound, which I think people looking to get into tube ampery are going to be looking for. So a little bit warmer than true neutral, a little bit thicker sound than what a lot of the solid state amps will do around this price or around a lot of prices. Now, are there solid state amplifiers that offer a warmer, thicker sound? Absolutely. But this one leans into that stereotypical tube-like sonic presentation. Everything else about it, though, is like pretty solid for a $250 unit. The resolution is good. You know, again, for a $250 piece, it's pretty solid. The spatial holography, ditto, pretty solid. Don't expect a whole lot of soundstage depth at a $250 price point, but I mean, there is a little bit there. It's not flat in the soundstage and all of that. The soundstage is big-ish, but not huge. And so forth. The tonal balance on it is pretty good. Like one of the comments I made about the Bokeh when I reviewed that is how well balanced its treble is tonally, meaning the relationship between fundamental frequencies and the harmonics is very natural and very realistic to my ears through that headphone. And I noticed that on this amplifier too here, the TA-66. So part of that strong tonal balance that I heard through the Bokeh was coming through on the TA-66. So I chalk that up there, that's a strong characteristic, okay, and a mark in the favor of the TA-66 here. But I mean, to tell you the truth, like there's really very little sonic fault with the TA-66, okay? You get that stereotypically warm, thick kind of tube sound that a lot of people are looking for at this price. Good resolution, good spatial holography, decently large soundstage, decent texturing, okay? All those kinds of things that you're looking for. I didn't really get a whole lot of fatigue. There wasn't really a lot of excess sibilance or anything like that. It's just, don't expect this to be a $2,500 a tube amp. It isn't that. It's a $250 tube amp, but at that price, it's quite solid. How do I know that it's quite solid at that price? I did compare it to the Schiit Asgard 3, which is about $280 US right now, or is it $270? Anyway, it's right in that range, only 20 to 30 bucks more than this one in price. And the Asgard 3 has long been kind of a reference for me for headphone amps in that price range, just because it's really good. And I recognize it's a solid state amp, so it's not a direct comparison to this. And the Asgard 3, because it's solid state and it has a low output impedance, it drives just about any kind of headphone type that you want that it has the power to drive. You know, it's not going to handle Susvara HE6SEV2 or the Modhouse Tungsten. Neither is this one, okay? But just to throw that out there, like the Ananda Nano, it handles fine. The Radiance, it handles fine, just as examples. Okay, but I pulled that out just to see where technically, sonically, this one stacks up there at the price. And with, it kind of varied from on the headphones and all of that. Like for the Bokeh and the DT8, or excuse me, for the Bokeh and the HD6XX, basically toss a coin between the Asgard 3 and the TA-66. They have slightly different presentations, where the TA-66 is just a little bit more tube-like than even the way the Asgard 3 leans, because the Asgard 3 leans a little bit warmer and thicker too. Schiit tried to make it sound kind of like a tube amp, and they more or less succeeded. But you get more of that stereotypical kind of tube-like sound from the TA-66. It's a little bit thicker in its presentation and all that. So like the 6XX and the Bokeh had a little bit fuller low end to them, a little bit more body in the sub bass as compared to the Asgard 3. And the 6XX in particular, I thought was just a little bit more impactful with kick drums and bass string plucks and that sort of thing than they were from the Asgard 3. The Asgard 3, though, had a cleaner sound to it and a more holographic spatial presentation to it. So it's really kind of just which way do you want to prefer there? I would say that on an overall technical level, they were pretty even. They just kind of both emphasized different parts of the technicalities and had different presentations. So it's very much going to be a preference thing at that price. But that helped me to place this thing pretty well. The DT880, I thought sounded clearly better on the TA-66, where the Asgard 3 struggled with it a little bit. The DT880 was the one that sounded cleaner and more holographic, and importantly, less sibilant, which can be a problem with that headphone, on the TA-66 than it did the Asgard 3. So there again, that just comes down to what are you driving, what are your sonic preferences, what are you looking for. It will be the difference between which one of those you want to pick, at least for sonic reasons. All right, what about comparisons with other OTL tube amps that are on the market, like the Darkvoice? Because if you look at the Darkvoice's price and you look at its build and what it does, you can tell the TA-66 is coming after it. And I can't really give you a clear answer on that one because it has been several years since I have heard the Darkvoice. I remember the Darkvoice was just a little bit on like kind of the sloppy and like noisier side, and I don't really get the impression that this is like that, although it's certainly not as clean or as controlled as like a Schiit Asgard 3 is here as a solid state amp close to the same price. So similar characteristic there, though I suspect strongly the TA-66 takes a step forward, okay, in that regard. The tube types in the TA-66, I think, are chosen to be a little bit different than what's in the Darkvoice because the types in here might be a little bit more accessible and therefore a little bit cheaper. Don't quote me on that, but I suspect that's what they are going for. But in terms of a more detailed comparison between the two, I really can't do that at this point just because, again, it's been years since I've heard the Darkvoice and I don't have one in here to do an A-B. Something like the Bottlehead Crack, which is also an OTL tube amp, which is a little bit more expensive, particularly if you get the Speedball upgrade, is going to give you more resolution than the TA-66 does, and an overall like cleaner and more refined sound to it. But it's also going to be at least twice the amount of money to be able to get that, so that's a consideration in there too. Okay, but there again, other than, I mean, the biggest drawbacks to the TA-66 here is really, it's not sonic. And if the sound out of the box is something you don't like, you can tube roll, right? You can swap out the tubes in here, which I didn't do. It's a $250 piece, so I wouldn't go too crazy on the tube rolling. Also, the tube types that are in here, I just don't have really any other of those kind of tubes lying around, so I wasn't really able to do that. Okay, but you can tune the sound a bit with tube rolling on this thing, and you're stuck with a particular sound with the Asgard 3, right? So that's another thing that you could look at here, though. But in terms of like drawbacks to the TA-66, I mean, it's really only for a narrow range of headphone types. The power switch is on the back, okay? And it's got that volume knob on it that not everyone is going to like, right? It's very clicky and it's got a fair amount of resistance to it in its turning there. And that's just going to be a preference thing that drives some people crazy. But otherwise, if you get the right kinds of headphones, if the power switch on the back doesn't bother you and that volume knob doesn't bother you, then there's really very little to complain about, and it's an excellent entry point into vacuum tube headphone amps. So that's it. I'm going to leave it there. Like, does the TA-66 get my recommendation for someone who is looking at exploring vacuum tubes for the first time? Okay, provided you get high impedance headphones to go with it, yeah. Okay, I have no trouble recommending it. I enjoyed listening to it. It impressed me in some ways, and so forth. So I think it's a good, solid entry-level unit. All right, we'll go ahead and leave it there. I'm Wave Theory. Thanks for watching. This has been my review of the xDuoo TA-66 entry-level vacuum tube headphone amplifier. It's a solid little unit. All right, please remember to like this video if you haven't. Check out my PayPal and my Patreon. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Leave a comment down below. And as always, enjoy the music.